in 1 Samuel 14, verse 1, we read that Saul's son Jonathan is so brave. He goes ahead with his armor bearer and he decided to go to the Philistine outpost without telling his dad, which is really wise. But we'll read that Jonathan is following the prompting of the Lord. And the Bible says that if we ask for wisdom, he will give it to us. And so Jonathan goes out, and Saul, instead of taking action, he was just sitting with his men. And the enduring word made such a great contrast between the two. Jonathan is trusting God and going out, and Saul is just sitting. And in my mind, I can picture him kind of like sulking, not taking action. And then in verses 6-7, Jonathan, he wanted to go over to the Philistine territory, and his armor bearer stood by him. He said, "I am with you, heart and soul." And I thought, what dedication. It really reminded me of David, who will eventually take the throne. He will take over for Saul. And David and Jonathan had such a beautiful friendship, and they were so loyal to each other. And the armor bearer's loyalty to Jonathan kind of reminded me of that in a way. And it just, I kind of thought it was a testament to Jonathan's character that someone would be that loyal to him. But verses 8-10, in those verses, Jonathan, he's boldly stepping out on faith. And in my Bible study footnotes, it was talking about, his decision to go ahead and seek out the enemy was because he believed that God will help his people and answer the threat of the superior Philistine military. He trusted God to show him what to do by testing the enemy's courage. If they lacked courage to come to Jonathan, that would signal their defeat, and then Jonathan would attack. So Jonathan trusted God. And in verses 11-13, both Jonathan and his armor bearer, they showed themselves to the Philistine army, and they called them over. They were just so brave. And Jonathan, he declared the victory before it even happened. So I thought that was pretty cool. In verse 14, it said that Jonathan and his armor bearer killed up to 20 men in just an area of a half an acre, which is not a lot of room. And in verse 15, we read how God, he confused the enemy. And God will do that. When God, Jonathan had the courageous spirit, and so did his armor bearer, to go out there and fight. But the victory belonged to the Lord. It was God who helped him and made him victorious, always. So then Saul comes along in verses 16-20. He pointlessly took account of who was left, and he discovered that Jonathan and his armor bearer were missing. And then he called for the ark of God because he wanted direction from God, which again was also pointless because he knew the enemy was confused. It's very clear that the time of attack is now. And, Saul, he sat and did nothing, and he should have sought God first instead of just sitting around while Jonathan was out there. He did seek God, and he took action. Jonathan courageously trusted God, and he followed the Lord's promptings. And many of the Israelites that betrayed their people, so we read about that, I think, in the last chapter. Some people, they scattered. Some of them went to the enemy to fight for them, which is such a coward move. Well, a lot of them ended up coming back because they said, what, Israel's winning now, so let's go back to the Hebrew army, that's really shameful. In verse 24, Saul declared that no man should eat food until the enemy was defeated, or else they would die. That's just so unwise. He was just acting out of his own flesh. He was not seeking God, and it's just not smart. This is not the time to not eat. They're in battle. These men are hungry. They need energy. And in Enduring Word, it said that it shows that Saul's sense of authority was wrong. He did not have the authority to proclaim such a curse, and he was not the spiritual leader of the nation. If any such fast was to be declared and a curse attached to it, Samuel had the spiritual authority to do it, not Saul. So again, Saul is acting out of his role. Remember how he presented the offering in the previous chapter. Well, again, he's just stepping outside of his role. He's not seeking God. He's acting out of the flesh. And again, he's a cautionary tale, right? We have to be careful to not do the same. In verses 25-30, Jonathan didn't hear of the oath, and in the woods it had a large amount of honey. Isn't it funny how, he's clearly not following God, because God, there's not going to be just honey everywhere when you walk into a forest. This was obviously the hand of God, and it's so clear that Saul was not seeking the Lord in so many ways. But Jonathan saw the honey and he ate it. And a soldier told him afterwards about the oath Saul had made, and Jonathan, he basically said it was pretty silly. And we have to remember again, the Lord provided the honey. It didn't just appear there on its own. Saul was acting out of his own feelings and his motives. Again, another cautionary tale. We can't act out of our feelings and our motives. We have to rely on God and God alone. In verse 35, finally Saul built an altar to the Lord, and he wanted to go plunder the enemy, but the priest suggested first to inquire of God. Hello, Saul, you should have done that before. But of course he didn't. And Saul was not focused on the Lord. And God didn't answer Saul's inquiry. And we read that in verse 37. So Saul asked God, it says here, shall I go down to pursue the Philistines, them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day. And I truly think it's because he's not seeking God wholeheartedly. In the previous chapter, God said he wanted a man after his own heart. In verses 38 through 46, Saul discovers that it was actually Jonathan that ate the honey and violated the silly oath. And in verse 41, Saul prayed to God out of, again, selfish ambition. He didn't seek God wholeheartedly. And again, it's just as a comparison when we read about David. David was a man after the Lord's heart. Now, David made mistakes. We all make mistakes. David made some pretty serious mistakes, but he had a heart after God at the end of the day, and Saul did not. And God, that's what God wanted. He wants people who seek him wholeheartedly. And Saul, he was so prideful. He even said, then Jonathan will die. He didn't even want to admit his wrong. And luckily, not luckily, but, I think, again, the hand of God, the men in verse 45, they all vouched for Jonathan, reminding Saul that he was led by God to help them into victory over their enemies. How can you kill your own son? That's just crazy, especially as the king. And in verses 47 through 52, Saul went into battle with the enemies of Israel during his reign. And then it goes on to talk about in verses 49, pretty much through 52, it lists the members of his family. And it said that all the days of Saul were bitter war. So, at the end of the day, to sum things up, Saul he didn't have a heart after God. He was after his own self, his own motives. He wanted to appear to be the one that was calling the shots and get the credit for things. He wasn't humble. He showed such a prideful, arrogant way about him. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7 in the ESV version. So Saul needed that reminder. We are, he who plants or waters, we are not anything. It is God who gives the growth and provides. And God determined that Saul was not fit for king, and so he was removed from king. So anyway, let me know what you learned. I post a new Bible study video on Wednesdays and Fridays at 7 a.m. Eastern, and I can't wait to study the Bible with you again. Bye.